Welcome, everyone. My name is Ben Kaler, and I'm the Science Coordinator for the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Welcome to our GCP LCC webinar series. We hold these on the first Wednesday of every month at noon Central. This is our October 2015 edition. The Gulf Coast Prairie LCC is a collaborative science support partnership working to deliver sustainable natural and cultural resource conservation in the Gulf Coast Prairie geography by sharing scientific knowledge, leveraging resources, and working toward common landscape goals. Our LCC chose 28 focal species that represent 17 broadly defined habitats in order to define, design, and deliver long-term landscape conservation to achieve the mission of the partnership. And in August of 2014, our steering committee approved our LCC science strategy, which identified the most critical science needs for 6 of these focal species. One of these top-tier focal species is northern bobwhite and was chosen to represent several grassland and shrubland habitats. Eastern meadowlark is also an LCC focal species representing grassland habitats. Today, we're joined by Dr. James Martin with the University of Georgia. In just a moment, Dr. Martin will talk to us about habitat loss and fragmentation effects in the management of northern bobwhites and eastern meadowlarks. This is one of 2 projects that we funded to address science needs of high importance for northern bobwhite in the Gulf Coast Prairie. In fact, we hosted a webinar last month for the other project, which investigated landscape metrics associated with population growth of northern bobwhite at multiple spatial scales. A recording of that webinar is available on our LCC YouTube channel, where we will also post a recording of our webinar today. Before Dr. Martin takes the floor, I would like to briefly introduce him. James Martin is an assistant professor of wildlife ecology and management in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. Prior to coming to the University of Georgia in 2014, he was an assistant professor and postdoctoral research scientist at Mississippi State University. He has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies from the University of North Carolina at Asheville and a PhD in Forest Resources from the University of Georgia. His research focuses on game bird ecology, including wild turkeys, northern bobwhites, and American woodcock. Furthermore, his research program centers around biodiversity and managed ecosystems. Now, before we start the presentation, we have a brief poll question that we'd like you, the audience, to answer. Greg Elliott, our communications coordinator, will administer the poll, so take it away, Greg.
Okay, I've launched the poll, and I'll kind of track as people respond. We have about 85% of the votes in, so
okay.
Get going, and I'm going to close this. Wait, 95%. All right, I'm going to close the poll.
Great.
And share the results. So there's the makeup of our group. 66% of you are wildlife managers or conservation planners, and 14% are state or federal land managers. 14% are research science.
Okay. Well, thank you, Greg. Just a reminder, we're all in auditorium listening mode. All of your phones have been muted, or your computer systems have been muted. If you have a question during the presentation, I invite you to write them in the chat box so that you don't lose track of your question. But also, you can use the hand-raising function in the attendee list, and we will certainly take questions and open it up for discussion at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Martin, we welcome you. You have control of the webinar, and the floor is now yours.
All right, thanks, Ben. I appreciate everybody for attending this. I know you all had to drive a long ways to get here. Hopefully you got the joke there. But this is the first time I've ever done a webinar, and I guess it's somewhat comforting to be sitting in my office talking to so many people from across the country. Hopefully you find this work interesting, and it can help reduce the uncertainty about managing bobwhites and meadowlarks on landscapes that may be of interest to you, and it will no doubt likely raise some further research questions that will keep scientists like me in work in the future. So, like was mentioned, this study is looking at the impacts of oil and gas development and woody cover on northern bobwhites and eastern meadowlarks. I remember writing this proposal very vividly because my wife was in the hospital having our third child when this proposal was due, and I remember completing the proposal at that time, and my wife kept giving me dirty looks across the hospital room while I was on my laptop and not paying attention to her. So I have to give her a little credit for allowing me to get this done. So I got to recognize some people. John Yiser is my PhD student. He was very instrumental in the modeling that was done, and so was Mason Klein. Did a lot of GIS work and modeling. Richard Chandler and Clint Moore provided a lot of technical support to us, and then Jim Giacomo with the Oaks and the JV with American Bird Conservancy spearheaded the data collection that would ended up being used for this analysis. So Ben mentioned this already, but I think it's important to understand the science in the context of management of conservation. So the objective of the LCC, straight from the webpage, states that the vision is a sustainable landscape of natural and cultural resources in that geography that is resilient to the threats and stressors associated with climate change and land use changes. Really, with this seminar or webinar, we're focusing on potential threats and stressors associated with oil and gas development and woody cover change. I think the kind of conclusion from this, without spilling the beans entirely, is that they're quite resilient so far to these stressors. The LCC goes on to say that we can't measure every organism in this environment, so they took a focal species approach, and two of the species used was northern bobwhite and eastern meadowlark. There was a recent paper by Crosby et al. I believe the work was done in Oklahoma that showed that bobwhites were good indicators of grassland and shrubland bird populations. As you can see from the graph, in areas where bobwhite presence was high, see if I can use this highlighter tool. So in this graph here, you can see that in areas where bobwhites were present, species richness was higher for other grassland and shrubland species, and the occupancy probability was also higher for grassland and shrubland species. Now, this does not hold true for all birds, but it does hold true for grassland and shrubland birds. So in that context, the results of this study are applicable to grassland and shrubland birds, that entire guild, but they're not applicable to other bird species within the LCC, most likely. And obviously doesn't measure the other environmental impacts of oil and gas development. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Okay. So why northern bobwhites and eastern meadowlarks? So they have, in this graph here, I wanted to show that they do vary in how they respond to the landscape and different habitat conditions. They are similar birds, but they do respond differently. This is from a paper recently that showed how eastern meadowlarks respond to forest cover in the landscape and how bobwhites respond to forest cover in the landscape. And you can see they both decline with the amount of forest cover, but the eastern meadowlarks are much more sensitive to that change. They have a very strong precipitous decline. starting at about 20%, whereas bobwhites a little bit more resilient to this change in forest cover, but do decline over time. So that there is a difference in how they would likely respond to any type of perturbation on the landscape. Similarly, this was a paper done by Sam Riffle in 2008, where he looked at a lot of landscape variables and how they affected northern bobwhites. And you see very common and through all these models, no matter which conservation reason we're talking about, is, CRP was very important, positively associated with CRP. And also positively associated with grass legume CRP. Bobwhites are, especially in the eastern range, prefer a very diverse herbaceous plant community with a lot of forbs and with some shrubs. And this model, without question, demonstrates this. The one difference you'll see now that we go to eastern meadowlarks is I want to highlight that in a lot of southwestern regions and in other parts of the country, pasture land is more important, because they are a bird that likes shorter cover. They like to be able to see their prey, so it's one of those situations where they have a different niche space, and I wanted to make that point clear. So we would expect some differences in how they respond to any of our landscape covariates. So a little bit about, sort of what instigated this concern. And, if you pay attention to the news, you'll know that there's been this increase in oil and gas well drilled throughout the last 100 years, with a market increase over the last 10 to 15 years. So there's been a huge amount of drilling that's occurred throughout the entire United States, not just Texas or Oklahoma. It's been everywhere. It slowed down a little bit with gas prices, but this is no doubt occurring. And this can be said for any type of energy development, whether it be wind or solar. Our impact or footprint on the environment is increasing dramatically. So this graph here is from a recent paper in Science showing the impacts of oil and gas development on ecosystem services. We see that over the last 12 years, the total amount of biomass impacted in rangeland systems or croplands has been dramatic. We see a very linear positive linear increase in the amount of impacted land cover over this last 12 years. That's in biomass, and here is an area occupied, very strong positive increase. And this also impacts the amount of water consumption that's occurred as well. That's how sort of the land usage change or land area change, but fundamentally we don't know how this affects critters. And that was really the impetus for this research project is, okay, we have some data within these landscapes that are have high density of oil and gas expansion or development. What's really going on? I'm not from Texas. I've never spent any time in Texas except for my quail hunt last year, and I hope to go back this year. And so I kind of use that to my advantage because I didn't have any preconceived notions, and neither did my co-authors, on what are the impacts. And I think it's good for scientists to maintain that level of objectivity. So we fundamentally wanted to understand how this affected bobwhites and the eastern meadowlarks. So this is a graph of the amount of wells permitted in the Eagle Ford Shale of Texas, and this will be our focal region for this talk. And the at the time that this was made, which is December of 2015, those green dots had been permitted for wells or on schedule to be oil wells. The red were on schedule to be gas. And you can see sort of the blue. I'm not sure how they're coming through on your all screen, but there are existing wells. So, relatively speaking, a very high concentration of wells in that area. So the question becomes, are these wells and the paths associated with those and the roads causing habitat loss or habitat fragmentation? And I think it's important that we understand the difference. I drill this into my graduate students' head, and I drill this into undergraduates' head. As conservation biologists, I think we throw around this term habitat fragmentation without implicitly defining how we're meaning it in any given context. So, for example, habitat fragmentation really is two processes, and they don't necessarily have to happen at the same time. So, assume we have some landscape here with some amount of habitat, and the habitat here is black is habitat and white is not habitat, so a binary landscape. Habitat loss would be the bottom left here, where the overall percentage of that habitat within a defined area decreases. So we've lost the amount of area of habitat. Whereas fragmentation per se, as Lenore Farrig defines it, is we could have the same amount of habitat, but it could just be distributed differently. In cases like this, what oftentimes happens is landscapes or organisms are quite resilient to this type of habitat fragmentation, because assuming there's connectivity among these patches, assuming the connectivity among these patches, organisms, in this case birds, can essentially see no net difference in populations. Based on theory, there's actually quite a bit of support that fragmentation of this variety can actually increase survival rates and of some organisms. There's obviously more work that needs to be done in that area, but habitat fragmentation per se, as defined on the bottom right here, is not necessarily bad for a lot of different organisms. And I think that's important to highlight here, because I think that's fundamentally how this is going to play out. Okay. A little bit more context. So I am a scientist, but I like to think about how things fit in overall conservation and management. So if we think about how research fits into conservation, using the strategic habitat conservation model that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the LCCs and a lot of people follow, is research is a part of this, biological planning feedback loop, where it helps inform that, along with monitoring, helps us plan, and then from planning we obviously go to design and deliver that, and then monitor, and this continues to go on. And so I think this research is part of that loop. There's already management occurring in this region through the Oaks and Prairie Joint Venture, through the GRIP program that Jim Giacomo spearheads, along with other folks, and it is no doubt part of this conservation delivery, part of the strategic habitat conservation. So, hopefully the results from this study can help inform that process. So the overall objectives of the study were to analyze the effect of oil and gas development on northern bobwhite and eastern meadowlark. We wanted to project or forecast these effects into the future under some fictitious, but possible scenarios. Also forecast what if we did some type of conservation, like reducing the amount of woody cover in some areas, or increasing it in some areas, or possibly doing management in oil expand areas, and then obviously identify areas in need of conservation is sort of the long-term goal. So we wanted to accomplish all four of these things, and we have definitely done 1 through 3, and fine-tuning number 4. So the study area, again, I'm an idiot when it comes to Texas geography. I was joking with Jim Giacomo yesterday about this. But the study area we were working in is between San Antonio and Houston. It covers the 8-county swath down that region. We have more data from other parts of Texas and in Oklahoma, but we're only going to focus in on that region today for the sake of time. So there's the study area of the 8 counties outlined there, and here's a zoomed in map of that, including Wilson County, Washington County, so forth and so on. So a large area. Texas is a big place. This would make up a significant portion of Georgia, so this is quite a big study area. We were able to take advantage of the JV's grassland bird monitoring. They started monitoring in 2013. Jim, I think spearheaded this. Texas State University was instrumental in data collection, and so was Texas Parks. So a huge shout out to those folks for doing this work. I don't think they intended it to have this purpose per se, but it's one of those good things about monitoring is you can end up using it for research. But again, we're focusing on these counties towards the south down here, and we didn't have data for all 3 years. For these areas, they started monitoring these pink counties here in 2013. The gray counties were started in 2014, and I believe all of the counties were done in 2015. We only modeled, for the sake of this talk, or focused on 2013 and 2015 data for reasons I'll get to in a minute. So, okay. I'm having to go back and forth between the highlighter and the regular clicker. Okay, so a little bit more about the data. They surveyed for 14 to 17 species, and that did vary by state, but again, we're only focusing on 2 of those species. They conducted 5-minute point counts and 1-minute intervals. They did 30 points per route, and there were 5 routes per county. So we had very good spatial coverage of those 8 counties, a very spatial rich data set. They recorded all distances to birds so that we could fit detection models to adjust our count data by a detection function. So don't let the math scare you too much. The only thing I want to focus on here is we modeled this as count data, and our overall model was what's called a hierarchical or in-mixture model, which means that we can include the effects of detection and the effects of covariance, like woody cover and on abundance, all in the same model. So these models are completely integrated, which means that you're including the amount of variability in detection and the amount of variability in the count data all in one step. And I think that's important to point out because it really shows the amount of uncertainty that exists. We're not trying to hide from a variability here. We're trying to incorporate it into our models. And you'll see towards the end that there is quite a bit of uncertainty. And that only points to the need to continue that monitoring so we can improve our knowledge of the system. So some basic results from the field work that was not done by me. It was done by many of perhaps you all on the phone. So thanks to you all. There were 350 surveys done that we used. There was more done than this, but we used 350 surveys from 350 sites in 2013. In 2015, we used data from 764 sites. In 2013, there was 112 bobwhite detections and 657 in 2015. And if anybody follows the weather and follows Texas, they can pretty much already figure out why that would be. Eastern Meadowlarks, we had 260 detections of those in 2013 and 308 in 2015. Our covariate values, it's important to note that in 2013, the landscapes around each point varied anywhere from 0% woody cover to 40% woody cover. And that woody cover variable, we got that from land fire data, so remote sensing data. And in 2015, we had a larger range of woody cover to model, and that was from 0 to 80%. For oil development, our covariate, we treated oil development as a binary variable because of the distribution. So a lot of sites had no oil development, and then some had quite a bit, or a significant percentage or higher percentage. So we treat it as a binary variable. So in 2013, 27% of the sites had oil development, and in 2015, 44% had oil development. Now, of those sites that had oil development, only 2% of the landscape itself in a 1,000-meter buffer around each survey location was in oil development. So that ranged from 0 to 2.7%. So not a lot of oil development per se within a particular landscape, and landscape being the buffer around each survey location. In 2013, that did increase some, and it did increase in 2015 to about 6%. So we're not dealing with a lot of oil and gas development within that 1,000-meter buffer, and that's important to note as well. So I'm going to jump right into the results. So to follow along at home, the x-axis is the percent woody cover within that 1,000-meter buffer, and the y-axis here is, on the left graph, is northern bobwhites modeled per point, and the graph on the right is eastern meadowlarks. And this is the expected abundance when there is oil present in the landscape, okay? So this is the effective woody cover when there's oil in the landscape. So we see overall that there's low counts in 2013, or low expected abundance. This is likely due to drought conditions or coming out of a drought conditions, likely explains that. But there is a strong, populations essentially drop out in this case when there's a lot of woody cover. If we contrast that to when oil is not present, we see that those effects go up quite a bit. So oil in the presence of these gradients of woody cover, we see that the abundances do increase slightly. This next graph here is the presence and absence of oil when you hold the amount of woody cover constant, and this is for northern bobwhites, and we see that we get very low abundance estimates. Those are not quite 0, but they almost are. And this is because the effect of woody cover was so strong that if you hold woody cover at the mean across all the landscapes, we get a very low expected count of bobwhite. This is for eastern meadowlark. Similar thing is happening. Again, overall abundance is low. When oil is present versus absent, there's not a strong effect. So this is how this is represented spatially. So we take that model and we can take our covariates, put them on a raster file, project them, use our model to predict, and these simulations, we do about 5,000 simulations. If I will go back for a second to these graphs, the blue line is the mean of the simulations, and the black lines are each simulation run. So they sort of form a cloud of error around that. So we're incorporating a lot of uncertainty in here. So if we look at this on in a spatial context, this is how it would project on the landscape. With the scale for all of these graphs that look like this are going to be abundance per pixel. Okay, so for eastern meadowlarks, this is using scenario 1. Okay, so scenario 1 is the status quo. So under current landscape conditions, this would have been the Bobwhite in 2013. And we see that abundance in general was fairly low. As I go through these next couple iterations, what I'm doing in the background, just so you can follow along, is I am increasing the amount of oil for the next couple iterations, but I'm holding the amount of woody cover constant. So this was projecting what would happen with a 5% increase in oil, a 10% increase in oil, and then I'm going to run 3 scenarios where there's a 5% decrease, a 10% decrease, and a 15% decrease. So this is status quo. If I go 1 scenario ahead, that's a 5% increase. If I go again, that's a 10% increase. Again, that's a 15% increase. I'll do those again. So that's status quo, 5% increase, 10% increase, 15% increase. And hopefully you were able to detect at least some changing of cells from green to yellow or more reddish colors. So that's the loss of abundance per cell. But it's not a strong effect, again, because we didn't find a strong effect in the model. This next scenario, set of scenarios, is when I decrease the amount of oil in a particular cell. So we see a decent amount of increase there, increase, and then it sort of tapers off. Okay. So graphically, this is how each the abundance changes over time by each scenario. So blue is Bobwhites, yellow is Meadowlarks, and this is birds in a I think 30-hectare landscape. No, excuse me. No, it's across all our sites, all survey sites for that particular year. So we see that changing oil production based on the 2013 results really doesn't have much of an effect on eastern meadowlarks or bobwhites. One reason why we picked -15 and +15%, because those are values that we saw within our data, so we could keep our data within the range that we estimated the model under. It's always dangerous waters to try and predict outside of what you observed. So that's why we picked those numbers. So here's the results for eastern meadowlark. So again, the abundance is on the scale here. So here's status quo conditions. We are increasing the amount of oil here, and we do see some changing occurring on the landscape. Excuse me, yeah, let me go back. This is a change in woody cover. So this is a change of woody cover for bobwhites. Excuse me, I misspoke a second ago. So this is a change of woody cover for bobwhites. So we're increasing the amount of wood cover. So we do see a positive effect because there was a weak positive effect. We do see some changing in the landscape. But all in all, it's still not much of an effect across the range of values that we picked. Likely because abundances were so low during that year that either we weren't able to detect any kind of trends here, or, for example, oil doesn't make up such a large percentage of the landscape. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and look at what happens if we increase oil by a percentage, 15%, and then decrease woody percentage by a similar percentage the other direction. So we do see that there's a little bit of something going on here with Meadowlarks, that if we decrease oil on the far right here and increase the amount of woody cover, we do see a somewhat of a reduction in abundance, okay, comparing this scenario to this one. It's very weak, but there is a decrease. So, and that's driven by that woody cover for Meadowlarks. I'm going to skip ahead some more. Okay, I want to get to 2015. Okay, this is the results of the models in 2015, the effect of woody cover for Bobwhites. And this is Bobwhites with oil along a gradient of woody cover. Excuse me, both oil is on the right-hand side, and without oils on the left, we really don't see any difference in the trend. They're pretty much the same. But we see a quadratic effect of woody cover. When we look at Meadowlarks, we see that very strong negative effect of woody cover. So these species, as we expected early on, they're responding differently to woody cover. So likely woody cover is an important driver here than oil production at this current time, given the oil that we were able to model. So here's the effect of oil development on northern Bobwhites, the predicted overall effect when you hold woody cover at their mean. Notice that compared to in 2013, we have a lot higher counts. We were near 0 in 2013. Now we have about 2 birds per point. It's gone up dramatically, likely due to rainfall, but still no effect of oil development at this current time. For eastern meadowlark, very similar. Holding woody cover at the mean, we see that there's really no effect on the expected abundance. So using the 2015 data, if we started out with the status quo scenario, we see that Bobwhites were very common. And having hunted in South Texas in 2015, I can attest to that. We see very high abundance estimates across the landscape. And it's very resilient based on these data once we go through scenarios. So if we start adding oil, as I'm going to do with each click of the mouse here, you see nothing's happening. And that happens no matter what. If we look at these graphs in this way, we see that there's really not much going on with the effect of, excuse me, this was for woody cover. We see not much going on in the effect of woody cover on bobwhite or eastern meadowlarks. Again, bobwhites are in blue, meadowlarks are in orange. So not a lot going on. Again, we do see these abundance estimates when we start to increase woody cover. There is a lot of uncertainty here, but we do see that their trend does start to go down and likely starts to decrease habitat on the landscape for eastern meadowlarks. Okay. Go through some more scenarios here. This is with change in oil production. Again, I'll flip through these one more time. Hopefully you can see that you do see some changing of the landscape going from green to orange. Green is a good color. And then once we start removing some oil development, it does have a slight minor positive effect. But in general, across the entire observed data and predicted data, we do see a fairly flat line. Again, they're resilient so far to the amount of oil and gas development, at least based on our models. So if we do the scenarios where we increase oil 15% and decrease woody by 15% compared to decreasing oil by 15% over here and adding woody cover, we see we do in general have higher abundances for bobwhites, but we have lower abundances for eastern meadowlarks. So we do start to see a divergence in the effects or the predicted abundances of bobwhites and meadowlarks once we start to get out where we're adding 15% woody cover on the landscape. I'm going to skip through these and running low on time. Okay, so all in all, we really did not see any negative impacts of oil and gas expansion to date. And I wanted, that may be somewhat surprise to some folks. It was a little bit of surprise to me. But given the small percentage on the landscape, looking back, it shouldn't have been that surprising. Woody cover was obviously impactful in general. But what's been found with other galliforms, with grouse species, is they do see a lag effect. And what they note here, and I'm highlighting this and underlining here, is what they do see is a delay of 2 to 10 years of energy development. So a lot of this energy development really came online 2 to 3 years before this data was collected. So it could be that we're just now in this lag phase, and given another few years and given some extreme drought situations, these possible negative effects may manifest themselves. We don't know. That's a hard process to predict, but it's very possible that lag effects are going on these landscapes. So that's one possible explanation for what we found. As far as the predictions go, we use some very crude predictions on how the landscape may change. Economic markets themselves are very tenuous to predict. I'm not an economist, but how different economic scenarios will play out in the future, it keeps people in business every day trying to figure that out. So we're not sure how these landscapes are going to change. And land use itself, in addition to the economic markets, are even harder to predict. So we may not have projected out, proper changes in the landscape. The third bullet point there is the scale of effect likely varies. And what I mean by this is we use 1,000-meter buffer around our survey locations. We tried 250 meters, we tried 500 meters, but 1,000 is where we found the strongest signal in our data set. That effect may actually be farther than that. So we weren't able to detect that, one, because we there was a lot of hand digitizing of a lot of this oil and gas development, which required us to narrow our landscape down somewhat. But we will work on that in the near future. We're trying to estimate how that scale of effect may actually be larger than 1,000 meters, because we could see actually a stronger signal by including a larger landscape. There's no doubt that weather was the major driver here, and could have been why we didn't see some of the effects that we may have anticipated. Bobwhites are very much been paper after paper published by the good work done in Texas about the effects of weather on bobwhites, and that really can overcome a lot of these other issues. And we could have gotten unlucky here where we had a situation where we entered into a year 2015 based on a lot of accounts was as good as it's been in a long time. And I hear it's maybe a little bit better this year, but we definitely had a situation where we had an eruptive population that may have overshot carrying capacity, so to speak. So we can't discount that as an effect. So there's caveats with every study, and our work is no different. Our overall abundance estimates at the site level, and then we projecting that out, we think are low. Because we have not accounted for a calling probability. This is especially important with bobwhites. Only about 40% of the bobwhites within a given area call during a 5-minute period of time. We modeled the detection part of that process where if it calls, we modeled that detection, but we didn't model the probability that it were to call. And so that would likely reduce our overall abundances. There were no temporal dynamics in our abundance model. We fit each year independently. With only 1 or 2 years of data on any particular site, it's very hard to model temporal dynamics in any other way. There may be some things we can try in the future. We weren't really able to get at threshold effects because of the binary nature of oil development in our survey area. There's likely a scenario where the percentage of oil in any given landscape, whether it be 10, 20, 30%, would reach some threshold. We did not predict out to that level where we might be able to detect that because we just didn't feel comfortable with the data set that we had. As I mentioned earlier, we did use a 1,000-meter buffer, and we do plan to explore additional buffers in the future. Vital rates are desperately needed in these situations. The grouse folks have been recipients of a lot of grant dollars to look at, the effect of energy expansion on vital rates, and have shown some pretty interesting things. Here we're just dealing with abundance data, which again is better than nothing, but to really get an idea of how these effects may happen over time, if we need effects, we need vital rates such as survival and fecundity. So future directions, no job is ever done until the final report's in or the publications are published. We do plan to expand the geographic scope, include additional covariates in the model. We kept it very simple on purpose for the sake of this particular effort. We want to use those projected surfaces to identify areas of conservation concern. So where areas where bobwhites and meadowlarks coexist in high densities are areas that you could potentially target for conservation, such as the GRIP program, to make sure that land does not get converted to something that's not habitat. Along those lines, the GRIP program could be having positive effects in these landscapes, and including those may help explain some of the resilience that we saw in our bird populations. This may be a little bit pie in the sky, but there's a lot of new modeling techniques out there that can integrate multiple data sets, and I realize BBS and Texas roadside counts for bobwhites are somewhat crude, but couple that information with this data may improve our precision and may give us a better resolution to our models. So with that, I'll wrap it up and thank my employers that pay my check and the Oaks and Prairie joint venture that was instrumental in the survey information. Obviously, the Gulf Coast Prairie for funding the research and the good work they do, Texas Park and Wildlife for assisting with the data collection, along with Texas State. Without those folks, this project definitely would not have been possible. So with that, thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Martin. It's certainly some results you presented aren't necessarily shocking, but some are kind of eye-opening. And I want to spool up our discussion here in just a second. But before I do that, we've got one more poll question for the audience here, and it goes to translating work like this into ways that we can communicate that information down to folks who might benefit by using it. And so those of you on the line here, if you just check as many that apply, thinking about where you get the information you use as you do your work, how you see results from a study like this finding its way to you in a way that you prefer. While you all are answering that, I'm just going to say that, based on the results of the models in these 9 counties, is it safe to say we don't expect that oil and gas development would strongly influence northern bobwhite and eastern meadowlark populations?
Do we expect that it would affect those populations under current conditions or future conditions? I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Under scenarios of future conditions. So it didn't seem like there was much of a signature.
No, there wasn't. It's part of what's going on. The devil's always in the details, but analyzing the data several ways, and trust me, we tried multiple ways because we, oftentimes really didn't trust what we were seeing. But I think there's a different effect of the roads associated with the development versus the paths themselves. And so how future oil and gas expansion affects bobwhites, there's got to be at some point where it starts to have a negative effect. Where that is, I'm not certain. But given current conditions, I think the fact that under the highest conditions that we observed of 5% of the landscape, bobwhites were very resilient to that. And based on my little on-the-ground knowledge, these paths are small, around a hectare or so in size, maybe up to 2, and they have edges around those paths, to me, look like pretty good bobwhite habitat, and my dogs would agree with that statement. And bobwhites, unlike a lot of these other galliforms, seem to not be as impacted by human disturbance as far as noise and things like that, whereas they're shown with grouse species is. So I would say overall we're seeing quite a bit of resilience. So I would say right now our models are saying no, there's not a negative impact.
Okay, and that not surprisingly, we'd expect local populations of eastern meadowlark to decline with the higher amount of woody cover, either through encroachment or succession.
Absolutely, yeah, and that was very strong. And there seems to be a gradient of woody cover in the study area going, north to south, and the eastern meadowlarks seem to be more common than the north, if I'm remembering correctly, and vice versa for bobwhite. So, there is this sweet spot where both species coexist at some local optima, and yeah.
Okay, so we have the results from the poll on the screen right now, and it seems like there's some preferences for writing this into a peer-reviewed journal article, certainly trying to host that data online in some way. But it looks like we've got a question from John Edwards. Let's see.
Okay.
John, you're unmuted if you'd like to ask your question. Okay, we're going to go to Tom Daly. Tom,
I can't
I'm
hear
not
Tom.
sure that, yeah, I think Tom has not input his PIN number.
Okay.
There is a question from Jim Giacomo as well.
Okay. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to type it into the box, the chat box below, or raise your hand, and we'll certainly give you.
So since Jim is not on the line, I can read his question. He says, any suggestions for best management practices directions, more grass planting, more shrub management?
Based on our results, I think shrub management is would be my the low-hanging fruit. And again, and this is something that we could potentially provide, is there is a sweet spot of, too much woody cover is bad for meadowlarks, and not enough is not good for bobwhites under wet conditions. And likely that occurs around 30 to 40%, just as a guess. So management of brush at that level, I would say for these two species of birds, would give the most bang for the buck, and then pray for a lot of rain.
Certainly pray for a lot of rain.
Yeah, folks in South Carolina may not agree with me today, but
Or tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow.
All right. Well, it looks like we're coming up to the top of the hour. I'm going to give one last call for any sort of questions we've got out there. Looks like Ed Harson's got a question. Ed, the floor is yours. Ed?
Yes. What was the basal area of woody and forested stuff?
I do believe that most of these areas were, there's not a lot of standing timber in most of this area. Somebody more familiar with this, on the ground conditions may tell me otherwise, but the woody cover in here was mostly shrub cover. If you look, go ahead.
Okay.
Yep. The NLCD data is always tricky. We ended up using the landfire data instead, but we did double check it with the NLCD data, and it maps a lot of this area as shrub cover and a lot of it's pasture land, and unfortunately there's not many data sets that can tease out exotic pasture land versus native pasture land. But that's why we went with the landfire data set for the woody cover.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Those data sets are somewhat limited. I wonder how the analysis would pair with the ecological systems mapping data for Texas. They have the state of Texas, they have their own several hundred land cover class data sets at a 10-meter resolution.
Okay.
I wonder, but that also doesn't differentiate well different types of grassland condition. We're sort of investing in trying to improve those things, but certainly outside of Texas and Oklahoma, most states are kind of hamstrung by the land cover data that they have available to them. I just wonder if you'd be able to pick up more of a signature using the 10-meter land cover data from Texas.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. Yeah, we're definitely at the mercy of those remote sensing data sets. And we know they're wrong. It's just a matter of how much. And we sort of picked the one that we thought best represented woody cover. But there's no doubt other covariates that other GIS or remote sensing data would pick up on.
All right. It looks like we are at the top of the hour. I don't see any other questions that have popped up in the last minute or so. So we're going to go ahead and say thanks for everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Martin, for presenting the results from this study. I'm sure I can join everyone by saying we look forward to seeing the results from this study in many different formats. And as soon as those things are available, we will do everything we can from the Gulf Coast Prairie to make them publicly available, either on our Conservation Planning Atlas, this recorded webinar, and of course the final product. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.